In the early months of 1994, Rwanda, a small country in Central Africa, stood on the brink of catastrophe. For decades, tensions between the two largest ethnic groups, the Hutus and the Tutsis, had simmered beneath the surface, rooted in a history of colonial manipulation, social stratification, and political rivalry. The Belgian colonial administration had codified ethnic distinctions, favoring the Tutsi minority over the Hutu majority, granting them access to education, administrative positions, and social privileges. This systemic favoritism bred resentment, which later erupted into cycles of violence after independence in 1962, as Hutu-led governments sought to reclaim power, often violently. By the 1990s, these tensions had hardened into an explosive mix of fear, hatred, and propaganda, creating a society deeply divided where even neighbors could become enemies overnight. The assassination of President Juvenal Habyarimana on April 6, 1994, when his plane was shot down near Kigali Airport, became the spark that ignited the genocide. Within hours, carefully orchestrated militias, local authorities, and ordinary citizens, fueled by a steady stream of hate-filled propaganda broadcasts on the radio and printed in newspapers, mobilized with lethal intent. Roadblocks sprang up across Kigali and other towns where armed men, often with machetes or rifles, demanded identification cards, scrutinizing names and ethnic markers. Those identified as Tutsi or moderate Hutu were dragged from their homes, sometimes with their families, and executed on the spot, while others were herded into churches, schools, or stadiums under the false promise of safety, only to face slaughter. Entire communities were engulfed in terror within a matter of days, as the genocide unfolded with an efficiency and brutality that shocked the world. The scale and speed of the killings were staggering. In the span of roughly 100 days, an estimated 800,000 people, primarily Tutsis but also moderate Hutus, were murdered. Families were torn apart, neighbors betrayed neighbors, and a sense of normalcy disappeared almost entirely. Daily life became a constant struggle to survive. People hid in forests, swamps, or under the bodies of the dead, clinging to whatever hope remained. Among the chaos, some ordinary citizens risked their lives to shelter those being hunted, creating makeshift refuges in their homes, farms, and schools. Their courage was extraordinary, given the near certainty of death if discovered. Stories of survival were often accompanied by unspeakable trauma, the loss of loved ones, witnessing atrocities, and the psychological scars that would linger long after the violence ended. The media played a critical role in shaping the unfolding horror. Radio stations like RTLM broadcast incendiary messages daily, identifying Tutsis by name, spreading false stories of supposed attacks, and exhorting the Hutu population to commit violence. Propaganda dehumanized the Tutsi population, referring to them as cockroaches, which normalized and encouraged participation in mass murder. Meanwhile, international media coverage was limited and slow, often portraying the crisis as another instance of tribal conflict without grasping the organized, systematic nature of the genocide. This lack of immediate, decisive intervention allowed the killings to continue largely unchecked, highlighting the world's failure to recognize and act on early warning signs despite intelligence and warnings from peacekeeping forces on the ground. The United Nations had a small peacekeeping force in Rwanda at the time, led by Canadian General Romeo Dallaire, but their mandate was extremely limited. They were instructed to avoid direct engagement and could not intervene unless directly attacked. Dallaire and his troops witnessed massacres, discovered caches of weapons intended for mass killings, and desperately tried to protect civilians, but were often hamstrung by bureaucratic red tape and the unwillingness of member nations to provide reinforcements or stronger mandates. In one particularly harrowing incident, Dallaire received credible intelligence about planned attacks on Tutsi civilians, but lacked the authority to act. His pleas to the UN for permission to neutralize the threat were denied, leaving him to watch the systematic extermination unfold, knowing intervention could save thousands of lives but having no official power to prevent it. Despite this, acts of bravery and humanity emerged amid the horror. Ordinary Rwandans, such as neighbors, teachers, and clergy, risked everything to hide Tutsi families or lead them to safety. One example was the efforts of Paul Rusabagina, the hotel manager in Kigali who famously sheltered over 1,000 people in the Hedo Demilco lines, using his influence, negotiation skills, and camaraderie resolved to prevent their deaths. In rural areas, farmers hid Tutsis in granaries or concealed rooms, sometimes creating complex systems of escape routes or safe houses. These acts of courage were not without consequence. Those caught aiding Tutsis were frequently tortured and killed, yet the moral determination of these individuals provided a faint glimmer of hope in an otherwise engulfing darkness. The genocide did not only occur in urban centers. In rural regions, entire villages were obliterated with chilling efficiency. Militias known as the Interahamwe, armed and mobilized by local authorities, swept through the countryside, often rounding up Tutsis and Hutu moderates and forcing them to dig their own graves. Machetes were the primary weapon of choice, though firearms and clubs were also used. Survivors often recount witnessing unimaginable cruelty, families decapitated together, children killed before the eyes of their parents, and neighbors, sometimes longtime friends, turning on one another in the belief that compliance would save them. Psychological manipulation, combined with peer pressure and fear, created a situation in which the line between victim and perpetrator blurred, leaving indelible marks on the social fabric of the country. Religious institutions, which many sought out as sanctuaries, were not immune to the violence. Churches that promised protection became sites of mass murder as militiamen rounded up those seeking refuge. One of the most infamous examples was the attack on Nairobi Church, where thousands of Tutsis had gathered. Despite their prayers and desperate appeals, the attackers stormed the church, hacking down men, women, and children. Accounts from survivors describe being hidden under the bodies of the dead or forced to witness unimaginable slaughter. These sites, once symbols of sanctuary, became grim reminders of betrayal and the complete breakdown of societal norms. Yet, even in this setting, some clergy members risked their lives to shield the vulnerable, concealing them or negotiating with attackers, offering rare instances of hope amid pervasive despair. The international response, or lack thereof, was a subject of profound controversy. But the scale of the killings became increasingly visible through photographs, reports from the UN, and first-hand testimonies. The global community was slow to act. The United States, France, Belgium, and other nations debated terminology, resources, and the political ramifications of intervention. The term genocide itself carries legal obligations under international law, and hesitation to label the massacres as such delayed meaningful action. Humanitarian organizations struggled to provide aid to displaced survivors who were often trapped in enclaves surrounded by hostile militias. Refugee camps became crowded with traumatized individuals, many of whom had lost their entire families, and basic necessities like food, water, and medical care were scarce. Amid this, some nations did eventually contribute troops, humanitarian aid, and logistical support. France, Belgium, and the United States eventually sent forces to secure evacuation corridors and protect foreign nationals, while aid organizations worked tirelessly to provide shelter, medical treatment, and psychological support. However, these efforts arrived late after the genocide had claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. The Rwandan Patriotic Front (RPF), led by Paul Kagame, advanced militarily to stop the killings, gradually retaking territory and ultimately ending the genocide in July 1994. Their victory came at a cost: vast destruction of property, continued displacement of civilians, and the enduring trauma of a society scarred by months of systematic slaughter. Yet it also marked the first step toward a fragile recovery, the rebuilding of institutions, and the pursuit of justice for the countless atrocities committed. Even after the official end of the genocide, the consequences were profound. Survivors faced the daunting task of rebuilding their lives amid the ruins of their communities, coping with the psychological scars of trauma, and navigating a society in which the distinction between victims and perpetrators was often unclear. Rwanda's justice system undertook unprecedented measures to address the crimes, including trials at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda (ICTR) in Arusha, Tanzania, which prosecuted high-ranking officials responsible for orchestrating the massacres. Locally, traditional Gacaca courts were established to handle the enormous number of cases, promoting accountability while facilitating communal reconciliation. These efforts, though imperfect, underscore the resilience of a society determined to confront its past and prevent future atrocities. The Rwandan genocide stands as one of the darkest chapters of the 20th century, a stark illustration of how propaganda, fear, and dehumanization can culminate in unimaginable violence. Yet within this darkness, the courage, selflessness, and moral conviction of individuals, those who hid strangers in their homes, those who negotiated with armed militias to save lives, and those who bore witness and later shared the stories of survivors highlight the enduring capacity for humanity even in the face of overwhelming evil. Their actions remind us that even in the midst of history's most brutal chapters, human bravery and compassion can shine, leaving a legacy of hope amid the horror. As the genocide progressed through April and into May of 1994, Rwanda became a country consumed by fear and violence, where the distinction between life and death hung on the flimsiest of threads. In towns and villages across the nation, Tutsis and moderate Hutus were hunted relentlessly. The militias, often aided by ordinary citizens compelled by fear or ideology, moved with methodical precision. Checkpoints and roadblocks were everywhere, and no one was immune. In the end, women and children alike were executed, sometimes after grueling interrogations about their ethnicity, sometimes for no reason at all. Survivors later recounted the sheer terror of attempting to pass through a street or cross a bridge, never knowing whether they would be recognized, betrayed, or killed. The air itself seemed heavy with dread. The sounds of machetes, gunfire, and screams became daily reminders that nowhere was safe. Entire families were wiped out in the blink of an eye, leaving survivors to navigate a landscape littered with the bodies of loved ones and neighbors. Many sought refuge in the dense forests surrounding their villages. They would live in fear for weeks or months, sometimes relying on the kindness of sympathetic locals who provided food, blankets, and guidance on avoiding detection. Water sources and farmland, once essential to daily survival, became perilous as militia patrols scoured the countryside, seeking anyone who dared to move. The psychological toll of hiding for prolonged periods, often in mud, under roots, or within hollowed-out spaces, was immense, leaving scars that would last a lifetime. The resilience of those who survived, however, reflected both instinct and a profound determination to live despite the odds. Churches, schools, and hospitals, which were historically places of sanctuary, often became sites of mass slaughter. One of the most horrific examples occurred at the Nyanj parish, where thousands had sought refuge. Armed militias stormed the premises, hacking down the innocent with machetes while survivors looked on from hidden corners. In other cases, hospitals became traps as patients and medical staff alike were executed, sometimes in full view of those desperately trying to care for the wounded. Even when civilians attempted to barricade doors or hide in basements, the attackers' persistence and cruelty rendered most of these efforts futile. Yet, in some extraordinary instances, the ingenuity and courage of survivors allowed small groups to escape, whether through underground passages, hidden stashes of food, or the assistance of brave neighbors willing to risk their own lives. Women and children were particularly vulnerable, facing not only the threat of death but also the horrors of sexual violence. Rape was used as a weapon of terror, systematically employed to humiliate, traumatize, and destabilize communities. Many women were assaulted publicly, sometimes in front of their families, as a way to terrorize entire villages into submission. Pregnant women were not spared, some were murdered, while others were targeted specifically because of their pregnancies. Children were kidnapped, forced into militia service, or left to fend for themselves amid the chaos. In towns like Butari and Gikongoro, survivors described the nightmarish scenes of entire neighborhoods being emptied, houses set ablaze, and families separated forever. The social fabric of Rwanda, once tightly knit by community ties and familial bonds, was being irrevocably torn apart. Amid this relentless slaughter, pockets of extraordinary courage and humanity emerged. Ordinary citizens who refused to succumb to the genocidal fervor risked everything to shelter Tutsis. Families hid neighbors in cellars, under beds, and within false walls, sometimes maintaining secrecy even from their own children. Teachers, clerics, and local officials leveraged whatever authority they had to negotiate with militias or create temporary safe zones. In Kigali, Paul Rusabagina's Hedodemo lines became a haven, where he and his staff employed ingenuity, diplomacy, and sheer will to protect more than 1,000 lives. He used bribes, intimidation, and appeals to international contacts to deter attackers and maintain the illusion that the hotel was under international oversight, even as the world outside descended into chaos. His actions were mirrored by countless others whose names remain unknown, individuals who understood the cost of morality yet chose to act despite the danger. Meanwhile, the Rwandan Patriotic Front (RPF), composed primarily of Tutsi exiles, advanced militarily from the north, gradually gaining ground against the genocidal forces. As the RPF moved southward, they were often confronted with the horrific aftermath of massacres, fields strewn with corpses, villages burned to the ground, and survivors traumatized beyond recognition. The advancing army sought to restore order and protect civilians, yet their approach sometimes sparked fear among those who had fled Hutu-controlled areas, wary of the RPF's intentions. Nevertheless, their intervention ultimately curtailed the systematic killings, though not before hundreds of thousands had perished. The military campaign, combined with the desperate acts of civilians sheltering the persecuted, underscored the complex interplay of fear, strategy, and moral choice that defined survival during these months. The genocide was meticulously organized, the local leaders playing a critical role in mobilizing militias and ordinary citizens. Propaganda campaigns had long primed communities to perceive Tutsis as existential threats, and the sudden chaos of April 1994 transformed these fears into deadly action. Lists of individuals to be eliminated were circulated, often based on pre-existing records, neighborly reports, or ethnic registration cards. Local councils and mayors frequently orchestrated killings in towns under their jurisdiction, directing militias to specific households and encouraging citizens to participate under the guise of civic duty. This institutionalization of violence created a scenario in which participation was often coerced or socially enforced, yet resistance remained a possibility for those willing to face extraordinary risk. The moral complexity of these choices haunted Rwanda for years after the genocide, as communities sought to reconcile acts of survival with acts of complicity. International peacekeepers remained constrained by limited mandates, often unable to intervene directly even when massacres were occurring nearby. In some instances, their presence provided only marginal protection, insufficient to prevent killings. Yet their observation and documentation became critical in subsequent efforts to hold perpetrators accountable. Reports sent to the UN highlighted the scale and nature of the atrocities, but bureaucratic inertia, geopolitical considerations, and lack of political will delayed a robust response. Humanitarian organizations struggling to provide relief faced immense logistical challenges. As roads were blocked, supplies were looted, and aid workers themselves were targeted. Despite these obstacles, medical personnel, social workers, and volunteers risked their own safety to tend to the wounded. Organized shelters offer psychological support to traumatized survivors. The psychological toll on civilians, both victims and witnesses, was staggering. People lived in constant terror, unable to trust even close family members, and forced to make unimaginable decisions about whom to save and whom to leave behind. Many survivors recounted being forced to witness the murder of friends and family, knowing that intervention could mean their own death. Children often endured the most harrowing experiences, witnessing violence they could not comprehend, navigating forests or urban ruins alone, and clinging to whoever showed kindness. The collective trauma left deep scars on the population, influencing social dynamics, governance, and reconciliation efforts for decades. Yet within this darkness, small acts of compassion, solidarity, and ingenuity, hiding neighbors, sharing food, or forging escape routes served as lifelines, reminding humanity of its capacity for courage even in the most extreme conditions. One of the most infamous massacres occurred in the town of Murambi, where thousands of Tutsis had sought refuge in a technical school. Militias deceived them, promising safety only to trap and slaughter them upon arrival. Survivors described floors soaked with blood, bodies piled upon one another, the suffocating stench of death permeating every corner. Similar atrocities were replicated across the country in places like Nairobi, Nyamata, and Kibaho, forming a pattern of deceit, entrapment, mass murder that defined much of the genocide. The meticulous planning and systematic execution of these massacres highlighted the chilling efficiency with which hatred, propaganda can be transformed into coordinated violence, leaving communities traumatized and destabilized. Despite the pervasive horror, the genocide also revealed the resilience and resourcefulness of the human spirit. Some individuals, often driven by profound moral conviction or religious faith, undertook daring actions to rescue others. Civilians constructed hidden compartments in homes or vehicles to smuggle people to safety. Soldiers and police officers occasionally defied orders, turning a blind eye or actively sheltering victims. Some local leaders, despite immense pressure from militias and central authorities, refused to cooperate with the killers, negotiating delays or escape routes. These acts of courage, though often overshadowed by the overwhelming scale of death, provided a fragile but essential counterbalance to the violence, demonstrating that even in extreme circumstances, the choice to act humanely remained possible. By June 1994, the genocide had raged for nearly 2 months, leaving the Rwandan landscape marked by unspeakable devastation. Entire villages had been reduced to ruins, with homes burned to the ground and fields littered with bodies. The psychological scars on the population were as severe as the physical ones, as survivors navigated a world in which trust, community, and safety had been obliterated. In urban centers like Kigali, the streets bore silent testimony to the horrors that had unfolded: abandoned bodies, shattered windows, and the lingering smell of smoke and decay. Yet amid the destruction, human determination and ingenuity continued to shine. People moved cautiously through these ruins, seeking the remnants of family, shelter, and food, clinging to the hope that survival was still possible. Even when everything familiar had been stripped away, the advance of the Rwandan Patriotic Front (RPF) became the turning point in the genocide. Led by Paul Kagame, the RPF had begun its offensive months earlier but intensified efforts as the killings escalated. To each town retaken, the army faced the grim evidence of massacres, often discovering mass graves, burned buildings, and traumatized survivors. The RPF's arrival, while bringing hope, also introduced complex tensions. Many displaced Tutsis and Hutu moderates approached the army cautiously, fearing retaliation or misunderstandings, while some fleeing Hutus feared retribution for participating in killings. Nevertheless, the RPF prioritized stopping the killings and restoring order, establishing control in key regions and creating a framework for humanitarian relief. Their military success marked the beginning of the end for organized massacres, though pockets of violence persisted in remote areas, where fleeing militias continued to hunt victims or engage in retaliatory killings. Refugee movements during this period created one of the largest displacement crises in modern history. Hundreds of thousands of Rwandans fled to neighboring countries, primarily Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Tanzania, Burundi, and Uganda. These refugees included survivors of massacres, children separated from parents, and individuals who had been forcibly displaced from their homes. The journey itself was perilous. Many faced exposure, starvation, disease, and attacks by armed groups along the way. Refugee camps eventually became overcrowded and under-resourced. The sanitation and medical care stretched beyond capacity. Aid organizations worked under extreme pressure to provide food, clean water, and medical treatment, while also attempting to document abuses and ensure the protection of vulnerable populations. Despite these efforts, conditions remained dire, illustrating the long-term humanitarian consequences of mass violence. Within Rwanda, the societal impact of the genocide was immense. Families were shattered, communities destabilized, and social cohesion fractured. Many moderate Hutus who had opposed or resisted the killings were targeted, and countless Tutsis who survived faced the painful task of rebuilding their lives amid loss and grief. Children became particularly vulnerable, with thousands orphaned and forced to navigate survival alone. Many of these children witnessed atrocities firsthand, enduring experiences that would shape their psychological development for years to come. Yet amid this devastation, survivors demonstrated extraordinary resilience, creating informal support networks, locating relatives, and working to rebuild homes, schools, and communities from the rubble. The process of recovery was slow and fraught with challenges, but it marked the first steps toward restoring some semblance of normalcy in a society devastated by hatred and violence. The international community, criticized for its slow response during the height of the killings, began to address the humanitarian crisis more actively as the RPF regained control. Aid organizations coordinated efforts to provide emergency relief, while governments contributed resources for food distribution, medical assistance, and temporary shelter. Simultaneously, the United Nations began investigations into the genocide, documenting crimes and collecting evidence for future prosecutions. These efforts were critical in establishing accountability for the atrocities, laying the groundwork for both international tribunals and local justice mechanisms. Although delayed, the documentation and preservation of evidence became essential tools for ensuring that the perpetrators would be held responsible and that survivors' experiences would not be forgotten. Justice and accountability became central to Rwanda's post-genocide recovery. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda (ICTR), established by the United Nations, pursued high-ranking officials responsible for orchestrating the killings. These trials, conducted in Arusha, Tanzania, aimed to bring to justice those who had planned, facilitated, or directly executed the genocide. They highlighted the meticulous organization behind the massacres, revealing the roles of political leaders, military officers, and civilian administrators in orchestrating mass violence. Concurrently, Rwanda established Gacaca courts, a traditional community-based system adapted to address the overwhelming number of cases. At the local level, these courts enabled communities to confront perpetrators, provide testimony, and seek a form of restorative justice even amid immense emotional pain. Together, these mechanisms represented both accountability and an attempt at reconciliation, seeking to prevent further cycles of violence and to acknowledge the humanity of those who had suffered. While legal and institutional efforts unfolded, the day-to-day reality for survivors was defined by grief, trauma, and the challenge of rebuilding shattered communities. Survivors recounted the profound sense of loss experienced through witnessing the deaths of family members, neighbors, and friends. Emotional scars were compounded by physical injuries and the destruction of property, leaving many dependent on humanitarian assistance for basic survival. In addition, the social stigma faced by women who had been victims of sexual violence further complicated recovery, as many were ostracized or felt shame despite being the targets of deliberate abuse. The process of reconciliation required both psychological and social support, as survivors grappled with the tension between seeking justice and fostering communal healing. Amid the post-genocide chaos, some extraordinary stories of resilience and reconciliation emerged. Communities that had once been torn apart by violence began to rebuild, often starting with education, healthcare, and agriculture. Schools reopened despite the loss of students and teachers, and programs were developed to reintegrate children who had been displaced or forced into militias. Health clinics provided both physical and psychological care, helping survivors cope with trauma and rebuild strength. Civic organizations and NGOs facilitated dialogue between survivors and former perpetrators, fostering a sense of accountability and communal understanding. These efforts, while not erasing the pain, created opportunities for healing and the reconstruction of social cohesion. Rwanda's recovery also involved confronting the political and societal legacies of the genocide. Leaders, both within the RPF and in local government, faced the challenge of unifying a divided population while preventing further cycles of retribution. Policies aimed at promoting national unity included removing ethnic identifiers from identification cards, fostering inclusive governance, and encouraging narratives of shared Rwandan identity rather than ethnic division. These measures were designed to reduce the possibility of renewed violence and to promote a sense of collective responsibility for the country's future. At the same time, memorials, museums, and educational programs were established to preserve the memory of the genocide and honor those who perished, ensuring that the lessons of 1994 would not be forgotten. One of the enduring legacies of the genocide was the remarkable courage displayed by individuals who risked their lives to save others. While the killings were orchestrated on a massive scale, countless Rwandans defied the climate of fear and hatred, offering shelter, guidance, and protection. Their stories illustrate the moral choices faced in extreme circumstances, highlighting the capacity for empathy, bravery, and selflessness even in the darkest of times. These acts of humanity, often carried out in secrecy and without recognition, stand as powerful reminders that amid widespread atrocity, the human spirit can endure and make a tangible difference in the lives of others. International reflection on the genocide also prompted broader discussions on intervention, human rights, and the prevention of mass atrocities. The failure of the global community to act decisively during the killings became a case study for the importance of early warning systems, rapid response mechanisms, and political will in preventing future genocides. Lessons learned from Rwanda informed subsequent peacekeeping operations, international law, and humanitarian strategies, emphasizing the need for vigilance, accountability, and proactive engagement in situations of escalating ethnic or political conflict. The genocide thus became both a tragedy and a catalyst for change, underscoring the moral and practical imperatives of global responsibility. Even decades later, the events of 1994 continued to shape Rwanda's national consciousness. Memorial survivor testimonies and educational initiatives ensure that new generations understand both the horror of the genocide and the resilience of those who survived. Stories of bravery such as those of Paul Rusesabagina, ordinary citizens hiding families and local leaders protecting civilians, serve as enduring lessons in courage and moral action. Rwanda's recovery, though ongoing, reflects a nation's determination to honor its past while striving for unity, reconciliation, and sustainable peace. In the months and years following the end of the Rwandan genocide in July 1994, the nation faced the monumental task of rebuilding not only its physical infrastructure, but also the social and psychological fabric of society. Towns and villages lay in ruins, fields once cultivated lay fallow, and entire generations had been decimated. Survivors emerged from hiding refugee camps and destroyed homes into a landscape scarred by violence, confronted with the daunting reality of mourning lost family members. While attempting to reclaim some sense of normalcy, building life required immense resilience, as communities faced the challenge of restoring trust among neighbors who had been pitted against one another during the genocide, navigating trauma that affected every aspect of daily existence, and confronting the moral complexities left in the aftermath of such orchestrated brutality. One of the most pressing challenges was the reintegration of survivors and displaced persons into communities that had been shattered by violence. Children, particularly, bore the weight of unimaginable suffering. Thousands had been orphaned or separated from their families, were forced to navigate survival alone. Many of these children had witnessed atrocities firsthand, enduring experiences that would leave psychological scars for life. Rehabilitation programs aimed to provide education, shelter, and emotional support, but resources were limited and the sheer number of affected individuals posed an overwhelming challenge. Yet despite these obstacles, many families and community networks gradually reformed, been relying on the mutual aid and solidarity of survivors to reconstruct households and villages. The process of rebuilding homes, schools, and local infrastructure became a tangible symbol of resilience, marking the slow but determined journey toward recovery. Justice became a cornerstone of Rwanda's path forward. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda (ICTR) was established by the United Nations to prosecute high-ranking officials responsible for orchestrating the genocide. Trials in Arusha, Tanzania, revealed the meticulous planning and coordination that had gone into the killings, holding political leaders, military commanders, and civilians accountable for their roles. In parallel, Rwanda implemented the Gacaca courts, a community-based justice system adapted to handle the enormous number of perpetrators. At the local level, these courts enabled survivors to testify, confront offenders, and participate in processes of reconciliation, while the system faced criticism for its limitations, including inconsistent procedures and the emotional burden on victims. It played a critical role in addressing the scale of the crimes and fostering a dialogue between survivors and those who had participated in violence. These legal mechanisms underscored the nation's commitment to accountability, while attempting to lay the groundwork for social cohesion. Alongside justice, reconciliation became an essential component of national recovery. The government encouraged a narrative of shared Rwandan identity rather than ethnic division, removing identifiers from identity cards and promoting inclusive governance. Programs were developed to reintegrate former perpetrators into society, provided they acknowledged their crimes and participated in reconciliation processes. At the same time, civil society organizations, educational institutions, and religious groups facilitated dialogue and community-building activities. Survivors and perpetrators alike engaged in conversations about responsibility, forgiveness, and the shared need for a peaceful future. This difficult and ongoing work reflected the understanding that sustainable peace required not only justice but also the rebuilding of trust, empathy, and shared purpose across a fractured population. The experiences of survivors highlighted both the fragility and the resilience of humanity. In the face of extreme violence, stories of bravery and moral courage were woven throughout the genocide's history. Individuals like Paul Rusesabagina, who sheltered hundreds at the Hutu lines, demonstrated how ingenuity, negotiation, and calm resolve could save lives. Ordinary Rwandans, neighbors, teachers, clergy, and farmers risked everything to hide Tutsis, forge escape routes, and provide sustenance for the hunted. These acts of courage, often conducted in secrecy, underscore the capacity for empathy and moral choice even amidst overwhelming fear and societal collapse. They provide enduring lessons about the power of individual action, the significance of standing against systemic evil, and the profound impact one person can have on the lives of many. The genocide also left deep psychological scars that persisted long after the physical violence ceased. Survivors contended with trauma, grief, and the challenge of reintegrating into communities where trust had been eroded. Mental health services, though initially scarce, became increasingly essential, offering counseling, support groups, and programs designed to help individuals process their experiences. Women who had been victims of sexual violence faced particular challenges, including social stigma and health consequences. Children who had been forced into militias or left to survive alone struggled with both behavioral and emotional issues. Over time, educational and social programs sought to provide healing spaces, vocational opportunities, and avenues for rebuilding lives. Contributing to the broader process of societal recovery, memorialization emerged as a crucial element in preserving the memory of the genocide and educating future generations. Sites such as the Kigali Genocide Memorial, Nyamata Church, Durama Church, and Murambi Technical School became places of remembrance, bearing witness to the atrocities and honoring the lives lost. These memorials preserved mass graves, documented survivor testimonies, and displayed artifacts from the period, providing both historical context and a sobering reminder of the consequences of hatred and dehumanization. Educational programs associated with these memorials ensured that the genocide's lessons were passed on, emphasizing the importance of vigilance, empathy, and the active prevention of mass atrocities in the future. Internationally, the genocide prompted reflection on the responsibilities of the global community. The failure to intervene decisively during the killings highlighted shortcomings in early warning systems, peacekeeping mandates, and political will. In response, subsequent efforts in conflict prevention, humanitarian intervention, and international law were informed by Rwanda's experience. Policies aimed at rapid response, proactive engagement, and the recognition of early signs of mass violence became critical areas of focus. The genocide underscored the moral imperative for nations and institutions to act in the face of impending atrocities, and it became a pivotal reference point in shaping global discourse on human rights and the prevention of genocide. Rwanda's journey of recovery was not linear, and challenges persisted for years. Infrastructure had to be rebuilt, the economy revitalized, and communities reestablished. Political stability required ongoing vigilance to prevent cycles of revenge or renewed ethnic conflict. The psychological and social consequences of the genocide were profound, influencing family structures, educational systems, and cultural norms. Yet despite these obstacles, Rwanda demonstrated remarkable resilience. Economic growth, investments in health and education, and initiatives promoting national unity contributed to a tangible sense of progress, while survivors continued to honor the memory of those lost through storytelling, commemorations, and community service. The process of reconstruction became a testament to both the human capacity for resilience and the importance of confronting historical trauma to build a sustainable future. Ultimately, the Rwandan genocide remains a haunting reminder of the destructive potential of hatred, propaganda, and systemic dehumanization. At the same time, it illustrates the profound courage and moral fortitude of individuals who risked everything to save others. The stories of survival, resistance, and reconciliation provide both warning and inspiration, demonstrating the consequences of indifference and the enduring strength of compassion. Rwanda's post-genocide recovery, shaped by justice, reconciliation, and memory, offers lessons for the world about accountability, the resilience of the human spirit, and the ongoing necessity of vigilance against hatred and violence. It is a narrative that, while marked by unimaginable tragedy, also affirms the enduring capacity for courage, empathy, and hope in even the darkest chapters of human history.